But a sealed notebook never meant to be seen has suddenly thrust the royal household into a storm of whispers and unanswered questions. Its pages, said to be written in a child's careful hand, reveal thoughts far older and deeper than anyone expected. When Prince William reportedly read the final entry, those closest to him say his reaction was one of stunned silence. Now the world waits, wondering how a single diary could shake the future of the monarchy itself. The discovery. The discovery did not arrive with urgency. It arrived quietly, almost politely, the way uncomfortable truths often do when they know they will be resisted. It was a late afternoon inside the residence, the kind where light thins early and the air feels heavier than usual. Staff moved with routine precision, clearing a small sitting room that had slowly collected personal items over the winter months. Nothing about the moment suggested consequence. Nothing announced that something fragile and irreversible was about to surface. The diary was found beneath a stack of children's books that had not been touched in weeks. It was smaller than expected, with a soft cover worn smooth at the corners. There was no name on the front, no decoration, no attempt to draw attention to itself. It looked less like a child's journal and more like something meant to disappear into the background. It had been placed carefully, deliberately, as though whoever hid it understood the value of concealment. At first, it was handled as an object without meaning. It was lifted, turned once, and set aside. No one opened it. There is an instinct, especially among adults, to respect the privacy of children. That instinct held for several hours. The diary remained on a side table as the room was finished and the door quietly closed, but unease has a way of lingering. Something about the diary's placement troubled the person who had found it. It had not been forgotten or discarded. It had been hidden. That distinction mattered. As evening settled and the household grew still, the diary was retrieved again, this time not as clutter but as a question. The cover opened easily. The first page was clean and unadorned, save for a date written neatly at the top. The handwriting was small but steady, carefully formed. Each letter given equal attention. This was not a hurried writing. This was not a play. The words were measured as though written by someone who had learned that clarity was safer than excess. The opening lines were simple observations about the day, about the weather, about rooms and routines. But there was an awareness threaded through them that felt out of place. Children often write what they feel. These words recorded what was seen, what was noticed, what was repeated. By the time the third page was turned, the realization settled in quietly but firmly. This diary was not a game. It was not my imagination. It was documentation. The decision to escalate was made carefully. No assumptions were voiced. No conclusions drawn. Only one thing was agreed upon. This could not remain unread by the wrong people, and it could not be ignored by the right one. Prince William was informed later that evening, not abruptly, not dramatically. The diary was presented to him without commentary, accompanied only by the explanation of where it had been found, and how long it appeared to have been kept hidden. He accepted it without expression. He did not open it. He held it for a moment longer than necessary, as though weighing something unseen. William did not read the diary immediately. He carried it with him, set it down, picked it up again. There was hesitation, not from fear of what it might say, but from the understanding that once read, it could not be unread. Privacy once crossed alters relationships forever. When he finally opened it, he did so alone. The first pages did not shock him. They unsettled him. The language was composed. The tone is calm. The entries were dated across recent months, written consistently, almost ritualistically. There were no outbursts, no complaints, no accusations. What stood out most was the absence of confusion. The writer did not seem unsure of what she was witnessing. She seemed certain. William read slowly. He stopped often. He reread sentences that felt heavier than they should have. There was a precision to the observations that felt far beyond what he expected. Not precocious in the way adults often praise, but perceptive in a way that left little room for denial. This was not a diary written to be found one day. It was written to survive quietly, to hold thoughts that had nowhere else to go. By the time William reached the middle of the opening entries, the room felt different, smaller, quieter. The air is heavier. He closed the diary not because he had finished, but because he understood that whatever followed would demand something from him, not as a future king, not as a public figure, but as a father who had just realized that his daughter had been watching far more closely than anyone knew. And in that moment, the sense of urgency finally arrived. Not loud, not visible, but absolutely what the pages contained. Charlotte wrote about mornings first. The way the house sounded before breakfast, which corridors felt busy and which felt empty. She noted how voices changed depending on who was present. There was an attentiveness to tone that stood out. Not what was said but how it was said, when laughter felt real, when it felt practiced, when conversation softened the moment she entered a room. She described rooms as if they held memories. Certain chairs were associated with silence. Certain windows are waiting. Certain doors with relief once closed. None of this was framed as a complaint. There was no bitterness in the language, only recognition. It read like someone mapping emotional terrain, marking where it was safe to stand and where it was better to move quietly. As the pages progressed, patterns began to emerge. Charlotte noticed differences between public days and private days. On public days, everything moved faster. Smiles appeared more easily. Affection was visible and frequent. On private days, the house exhaled. People spoke less. Time stretched. She wrote that the quiet afterward felt heavier, like the echo after music stops. One entry described a family dinner with remarkable detail. Who spoke first? Who asked questions? Who answered and who did not? She wrote about pauses that lasted just a little too long and about glances that carried more meaning than words. Then several pages later, she described another dinner almost identical in structure, yet entirely different in feeling. The contrast between the two entries was striking. It revealed a child who understood that the same setting can hold completely different truths. There were moments of tenderness woven throughout the diary. Charlotte wrote warmly about her brothers, about shared laughter and private jokes, about feeling protective without knowing why. Her admiration for her mother appeared often expressed through small observations rather than declarations. She noticed when her mother looked tired, when she smiled anyway, when she seemed lighter and when she seemed distant. Her father appeared in the diary as a figure of steadiness and weight. She wrote about him with respect that bordered on reverence. But even here the observations carried complexity. She noted when he seemed distracted, when his attention felt divided, when responsibility seemed to follow him from room to room like a shadow. What made the diary unsettling was not the content itself, but the clarity with which it was presented. Charlotte did not write as someone confused by adult behavior. She wrote as someone trying to understand it without disrupting it. Her questions were rarely written as questions. They were framed as thoughts, as conclusions quietly reached. She wrote that sometimes people can love each other and still feel far apart. She wrote that silence can mean different things depending on who chooses it. She wrote that being important seems to mean people need things from you even when you are tired. These were not the words of a child repeating something she had heard. They were the words of someone synthesizing experience. As William continued reading, he realized something that unsettled him deeply. Charlotte never positioned herself at the center of these observations. She did not write about how events made her feel directly. Instead, she wrote about how the house felt, how the air changed, how energy shifted. This was the language of adaptation, not expression. Children who feel secure often write freely. They complain. They exaggerate. They demand. Charlotte documented, she recorded, she measured. One entry stood out among the rest, written with tighter handwriting and narrower spacing, as though the thought had required effort to contain. She wrote that she did not think it was her job to fix anything, but that she thought it was important to understand it. The sentence was simple, but its implication was heavy. It suggested a child who had already accepted emotional responsibility without being asked. There was no anger in the diary, no resentment. That absence was perhaps the most telling detail of all. Charlotte was not reacting. She was preparing to navigate a world she sensed was more fragile than it appeared. By the end of the entries, William understood why the diary had been hidden so carefully. These pages were not meant to accuse. They were meant to preserve truth quietly in case it was ever needed. The words did not demand action, yet they demanded recognition. What Charlotte had written did not stun William because it was shocking. It stunned him because it was accurate. William reads what he was never meant to see. William chose to read the remainder of the diary in solitude. He waited until the household had settled into its deepest quiet. When doors no longer opened unexpectedly and the night carried a sense of privacy that daylight never allowed, the diary rested on a small table beside him for some time before he touched it again. He understood that what remained inside would not simply inform him. It would confront him. The later entries were heavier in tone, though the language remained calm. There was a sense of accumulation, as though each observation rested upon the last, building a structure of understanding that Charlotte had been constructing silently. William noticed how the entries became more focused, fewer descriptions of rooms and routines, more attention to moments between people. One passage described watching her parents from across a room. The words were simple, but they landed with unmistakable force. She wrote that they looked as though they were standing next to each other rather than with each other. William read the sentence several times. It felt uncomfortably precise, not because it was unkind but because it was fair. He paused often, closing the diary only to open it again moments later. Each page seemed to remove a layer of distance he had unconsciously maintained between his public life and his private one. This was not commentary shaped by headlines or expectation. It was the perspective of someone who loved him without condition and therefore saw him without illusion. Another entry spoke about responsibility. Charlotte did not define it as something imposed or taught. She described it as something absorbed, something that settled into a person and stayed there. She wrote that being important appeared to mean that people needed things from you even when you were tired. William felt the words tighten in his chest. He recognized himself in them far too clearly. He stopped reading again and set the diary aside. The silence in the room felt amplified. He became acutely aware of the many times he had returned home physically present but emotionally elsewhere. Meetings followed him. Decisions lingered. Worries remained unspoken but ever present. He had believed himself careful. He now wondered how often his absence had been felt, even when he was there. When he resumed reading, the entries grew more introspective. Charlotte began writing less about what she saw and more about what she believed. Not beliefs handed down to her, but beliefs formed quietly. She wrote that grown-ups sometimes hide things because they are afraid of breaking. She wrote that bravery did not always look loud and that sometimes it felt heavy. William closed the diary at that point and rested his hands on the cover. He was not overwhelmed by guilt in the way he might have expected. What he felt instead was clarity, a recognition that love and intention are not always enough to protect children from awareness. They notice what adults hope will remain invisible. The most difficult entry came near the end. The handwriting was noticeably tighter, the margins narrower.